Obrazek, nie? Zapytam pana, nie?
Czekaj, już idę.
So we've seen, for example, Article 4 invoked twice in the past month. Once by Poland, after we saw like a large number of drones enter its airspace from Russia, Russian drones enter its airspace. And then we've seen it invoked again later in September by Estonia after Russian jets entered its airspace. And what that, again, the response to both of those respectively, they're quite flexible, was that we saw in the case of the Polish incursions, saw NATO launch a new operation called Eastern Sentry, which is to kind of police the airspace along kind of the NATO eastern flank, more proactively become more involved in the region, among some other next steps. And now after the Estonian kind of consultation that was called, we've seen NATO be quite, really set quite clear lines and express itself quite forcefully about this kind of continued incursions, like that there might be actual real consequences if Russia continues to do that and violates the airspace of other NATO members.
Following the meeting, allies issued a strong statement of solidarity and resolve. They condemned Russia's reckless actions, which are escalatory, risk miscalculation, and endanger lives. Allies affirmed yet again that our shared commitment to collective defense is unshakable. We do not want to see a continuation of this dangerous pattern by Russia, intentional or not, but we stand ready and willing to continue to defend every inch of Allied territory.
Także w warunkach operycznej widoczności, nie narażając załogi, czołg może operować w terenie zatrutym, skażonym i napromieniowanym.
So Article 5 is really the article that gets invoked if a country feels that it's basically undergoing an armed attack. And that's actually only been invoked once in the NATO's history by the United States, kind of following the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
On September the 12th, the North Atlantic Council met again in response to the appalling attacks perpetrated yesterday against the United States of America.
Triggering Article 5 is not automatic, so a member state needs to trigger it. So in this case, you would probably think of, say, Poland, which is the one that's had a couple of these sort of spillover incidents, if you will, with drones entering its airspace or missiles landing there throughout the war, would need to deem one of those incidents as serious enough to consider that a sort of armed attack.
Any questions?
Mr. President, do you think that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace?
Yes, I do.
Mr. President, any update on your talks with President Putin, and do you still trust him?
And what happens after a country invokes Article 5 is not necessarily that we immediately see a military response, which is a lot of people often think, but rather that the NATO alliance members also come together and basically make this political commitment that if one country invokes Article 5, that they should come to the aid of that country. What shape that takes is up to the different members of the alliance. So they'll come together, they'll have consultations, and they, according to the ways they deem fit, can choose to respond in different ways, whether that's politically, whether that's actually militarily. It is very concerning that we see these incidents where Russia, whether it's drones, whether it's airplanes, is clearly testing sort of the limits of, of the red lines of how the NATO alliance might respond to some of these incidents. And you could see perhaps whether that's through Ukrainian airspace, something that maybe spills over from, say, an attack launched on Ukraine that makes its way over the border, being misinterpreted as a maybe more kind of targeted attack on one of the alliance members. So we could envision a scenario like that. I don't think that would necessarily trigger Article 5, because again, that's not automatic, but it could be misinterpreted. It's not impossible. Or on the other hand, some of these other hybrid escalations that we see as well bring similar risks. So it's definitely the case that we see Russia act quite brazenly here and kind of increasingly testing the limits of how far they can go before they get a quite a more serious response from NATO.
World attention centers on Washington as in the State Auditorium, representatives of 12 nations of Western Europe and North America assemble for the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. America's Secretary of State, Mr. Dean Acheson, greeted President Truman, whose message to the Western democracies was carried to all parts of the globe.
This treaty is a simple document. The nations which sign it agree to abide by the peaceful principles of the United Nations.
President Truman signs the proclamation putting the Atlantic Charter into effect.
So I'd say Article 4 and particularly Article 5 are really sort of quite foundational building blocks behind the NATO alliance. And it kind of underpin this idea of kind of a principle of collective defense, which is really the main purpose of NATO. So Article 5 in particular is the article that states that effectively an attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on all. So this has really been kind of at the heart of NATO from the very outset. Article 4 is the kind of the step before. It's not necessarily that 4 needs to be invoked before 5, but is kind of one step further down, and that's that any member of the alliance, if they consider their security or independence under threat, can invoke Article 4, and that basically brings the alliance together for consultation.